Darren looked straight at me. His eyes didn't blink, like he just reached some grand conclusion and was waiting for me to collapse under it. "You don't have any dreams," he said. "You're just clinging to the life I built." The room was so quiet, I could hear the kitchen clock shift its rhythm. I was still standing by the dining table, my hand resting on the back of a chair, not moving, not answering, just looking at him, a look short enough not to make a scene, but long enough for me to wonder when he started believing that was true. He said it in front of Calvin, his longtime friend. Calvin froze mid-sip, trying to pretend he hadn't heard it, but I saw his face tighten. Darren didn't stop. He said it again, softer this time, like a statement he'd rehearsed. I didn't say anything, not because it hurt, but because in that moment, and I felt a clear line open inside me, like a cut running down my chest, not deep enough to make me fall, but cold enough for me to know something had just changed. I pulled the chair a little toward me, adjusting it like I was just tidying up after dinner. Still not looking at Darren a second time, not giving him an explanation, not giving him a reaction. He wanted a collapse, but all he got was silence. A part of me watched the moment from the outside. Darren, the man who once believed that if he tried hard enough, the whole world would bend for him. And me, the one who walked beside him for 10 years, quietly patching the holes he never noticed. His words were still echoing in my head, but they no longer carried the weight he imagined. Instead, weren't they felt like the last page peeling off a file that had been full for a long time? "You don't have any dreams." A sentence that should have hit hard, yet when it fell into my silence, it sounded strangely hollow. I picked up a spoon from the table and set it in the sink, washed my hands, dried them. Every movement small and steady, but in each one I felt something shift. I had just stepped out of the role of the wife he thought he could define. Calvin stood up first. He said a few vague things, then left so quickly I knew he just wanted to escape the air in that room. When the door clicked shut, the house went back to what it really was, quiet and offbeat. I turned to look at Darren. He crossed his arms, took a breath like he just won an argument no one else was part of. "You're not going to say anything?" he asked. "I am," I said, my voice low and even. "You just can't hear it." A flicker of confusion crossed his face. He was used to me being soft, stepping back, smoothing things over. Today, I didn't do that. Not because I was angry, but because something had just become clearer than ever. "If you want to understand why I'm quiet," I said, "you've got to go back 10 years. My name is Talia. I've always been the patient type, the kind of patience that makes people think I don't feel pain. I've had this habit of enduring things in silence, not because I'm weak, but because I need to be sure something is worth speaking up for. But that habit made him believe I was standing still. Darren was the opposite. He's the kind of person who believes in straight lines. He moves, others follow. His confidence pulled me along for years, until I realized it covered up a lot, including the possibility that he could be wrong. We weren't always like we were tonight. 10 years ago, we had nothing but an old car, a cramped rented room, and one tiny dream. To live enough. To live in peace. We did anything we could to survive. Shifts that ran late into the night. Mornings where we both woke up still wearing the smell of exhaustion on our clothes. Some days, we just looked at each other and laughed because we were too tired to do anything else. We were a team. A real team. When he fell, I pulled him up. When I was worn down, he carried more. Neither of us ever said it out loud, but we both knew neither one could make it alone. That's why what he said tonight wasn't just an insult. It was the distortion of something that used to hold us together. When he said I didn't have dreams, he wasn't just denying my present. He was denying the person who walked beside him all those years. He was denying the nights I stayed up waiting for him to come home. The days I counted every dollar so we wouldn't be late on rent, the times I stitched together every tear in our life that he never noticed. And what kept me silent wasn't that I didn't know what to say. It was knowing that his words didn't just pop into his head tonight. They'd been there for a long time. Tonight was simply the first time he felt comfortable enough to say them out loud. I stood by the window, watching the street lights spill onto the tile floor. Still, cold, clear. When we started, I thought we were a team. So when did you forget that? I didn't wait for an answer. I only needed to record the truth of that moment. A single sentence sharp enough to split the last thin layer of fabric, exposing things I never looked at directly. And in that silence, I realized the most important part. What he said tonight was just the surface. I had no idea what I was about to uncover beneath it. After that night, when the bedroom door closed behind Darren, I stood alone in the dark hallway, not angry, not sad, just sensing something as clear as the tile lines under my feet. To understand how he could say it so lightly, I had to go back to where our story first began to tilt. 10 years ago, we had nothing but our empty hands and the naive belief that if we tried hard enough, things would eventually take shape. I remember the nights when we sat under a dim yellow light in that rented room, our feet aching from hours of standing, our hands burning from warehouse shifts, deliveries, and whatever odd jobs we could find. Night shifts that made our eyes feel like lead, yet we still laughed because we kept thinking, it'll get better. We used to talk about a small house, a child running around the yard, a life that didn't have to be fancy, just steady. I believed a shared dream was stronger than anything, and back then, maybe it was. But a shared dream only survives if both people hold it. When one lets go, the other has to carry all the weight left behind. I don't know when I started being the one who carried more. When our first child was born, me leaving my job wasn't a sacrifice. It was the most reasonable choice at the time. Darren told me gently, just a few years, then you can go back. I believed him. He sounded like someone thinking about our family, and I believed he understood the new weight would be split between us. But the years that followed didn't look anything like the promises we made. Darren started getting used to everything being taken care of before he even had to think about it. Dinner was always ready. I handled our child's schedule, bills, family matters, every small and big task. Everything ran smoothly because I was the one arranging it behind the scenes. Darren had a line he repeated so often it became background noise. You're so good at this. It sounded like praise, but it wasn't recognition. It was more like he was crossing my name off the world outside our home. There were times when his friends gathered, talking about promotions, about their wives being busy with new jobs. I'd hear him laugh and say, Talia's different. She's gentle. She's more suited for family life. Those comments were light as feathers, but each one dropped another small stone into the box he wanted me to stay in. At first, I thought he was just careless, but carelessness repeated over and over stops being carelessness. I remember clearly the first time I said I wanted to take a short class at a center near our house. Just 4 evenings, nothing that would affect the family. Darren looked at me like I'd just announced something reckless. Let me handle things, he said. You're tired all day. Save that for later. It sounded thoughtful, but when I stayed quiet, he took it as the end of the conversation. I wasn't angry that day. I just felt a door quietly close, one he didn't even notice. Another time, I found a part-time job I could do from home. I didn't even finish explaining before Darren said, Why would you do that? I'm earning enough. You don't need the pressure. His don't need felt like a loose rope falling around my neck. Not tight, but tight enough to remind me he wanted me still. Little by little, the phrases that sounded protective started to smell like control. Let me handle it stopped being teamwork and became a way to block every direction I might step toward. And I, someone who always believed in the quiet balance between us, started waking up. I realized that every time I tried to move forward, even a little, he pulled me back with a reason that sounded perfectly reasonable. The more reasonable the reason, the harder it was to push against. That's the most dangerous kind of control, the kind that looks like love. But what I saw most clearly through those years wasn't unfairness. It was misalignment. He kept climbing step by step, and with every step he took, he looked down and saw me standing still. He never asked why I wasn't moving. He simply believed that staying still was who I was. I didn't speak up, not because I agreed, but because I was watching. From the moment our child learned to walk, to preschool, to every raise Darren got, every new responsibility he took on, I kept noticing his expression whenever someone asked, "How's Talia doing?" His answer always revolved around the house, the kids, the things I did well within the boundaries he'd set. He never spoke about me as someone with her own direction. He talked as if I were just the background to his life. I never argued. Oh, but every one of those answers carved another mark into my awareness. When there are enough marks, they form a picture. Looking back now, I see clearly that he'd grown used to a version of me he created. Someone who stepped back so he could step forward. Someone who did everything so he could focus on his career. Someone he could rely on but never had to acknowledge. Someone who could never outgrow him. And today, when he said I didn't have dreams, I suddenly understood why the line came out so smooth, so natural. Because in his mind, I'd been in that position for a long time. Not because I chose it, but because he needed me there so he wouldn't feel threatened. I leaned against the wall, letting the cold seep through my shirt. I thought about those 10 years, about every small misalignment that grew into the distance between us now, and the clearest feeling that rose wasn't regret. It was a sharp certainty. Darren is keeping me in the place where he believes I can't go any farther than him. I don't know why he needed me to stay in that place so badly, but I do know this. Whatever made him confident enough to say what he said tonight wasn't simple. And that was the beginning of the secret I was about to face. I'm not someone who gets surprised easily. 10 years beside Darren taught me how to recognize the moments right before he said something that would hurt. He had this habit of taking a small breath first, like he needed to steady the words. That afternoon was no different. We were at Melissa's house, Darren's sister, who never hid the judgment in her eyes when she looked at me. Dinner seemed normal, but the air thickened when Melissa asked Darren about his new project, the one he'd been bragging about all week. "I got this far because of my own hard work," he said, sounding more proud than usual. Then he turned to me. "I'd still go far without you," Darren said. "You don't have any ambition anyway." The sentence hit the table like something heavy. Melissa let out a small laugh, the kind of laugh from someone who finally hears what they've been waiting for. I could see the satisfaction in her eyes, but I still didn't react. I set my glass down, gently enough that it didn't make a sound. I didn't look at Melissa. I didn't look at Darren. I looked at the dark wooden table in front of me, as if I were reviewing the signature on an agreement I never agreed to. My silence only made Darren more confident. He thought he'd struck the truth, that he'd put me in my place. But what was really happening was the opposite. I was standing up on the inside, inch by inch. I saw everything clearly. Melissa leaning back, arms crossed, satisfied with every word. Darren lifting his chin, as if that sentence put him a step higher. Neither of them noticing the moment I stepped out of the role they'd assigned me. While Melissa poured more wine for Darren, she let something slip. "If Darren didn't stop you, you'd probably be busy working somewhere right now." I heard it like the sound of something cracking, small, sharp, enough to make me stop breathing for a second. Stopped? When? And more importantly, why did she know that? I lifted my head and looked at Melissa. Her eyes slipped, revealing more than she meant to. That wasn't an accidental comment. It was information she'd held on to, familiar enough to spill without thinking. "Stopped what?" I asked, my voice as steady as still water. Melissa blinked fast, flustered. Oh, I mean, Darren just cares about the family. Darren shot her a quick look, sharp enough to warn her. He changed the subject right away, asked about dessert, but the words were already out, and they hung in the room like a needle, signaling a storm. I didn't say anything else, but inside, memories began to move. The scattered pieces I'd ignored started arranging themselves into something with shape. I remembered when my old company reached out, saying they wanted to meet about a new position. Darren had answered the phone that day, told them I was busy with the baby. When I asked later, he said they'd pick someone else. I believed him. I remembered the time I wanted to sign up for a class. I'd talked about it for a week, but on registration day, Darren told me the spots were full and no need to rush anyway. Back then, I thought life just worked that way. Opportunities came and went. Not everything landed at the right time. But now, replaying it, every loose dot connected into a clean line. And that line led straight to him. I watched Darren as he laughed at something Melissa said. His face was calm, untouched by worry. He didn't think I'd linger on her slip. He didn't think I'd connect the pieces. He believed I was still the woman who stayed put. But for the first time in years, I saw something clearly. His insult tonight wasn't an accident. Or it was the result of a belief he'd held for a long time, that I'd been kept still for so many years, I no longer had anywhere to go. I placed my hand on the edge of the table, feeling the cold surface. The chill helped me stay steady, stay awake inside a room that suddenly felt like it was closing in on me like a box. Melissa kept talking about some relatives' kids, but I didn't hear a word. I was walking back through 10 years, step by step, replaying moments I once brushed off as coincidence, and the more I looked, the clearer they became. If everything had been random, why did Melissa know? If Darren had only wanted to protect me, why didn't he tell me about the times he stopped something? If he respected me, how could he say I had no ambition right in front of his sister? None of the answers led anywhere good. I looked at him for the first time that entire dinner. My eyes met his, and I saw it. The quiet smugness of someone who believed he had the whole story under control. A part of me no longer wanted to argue or demand explanations. I didn't need explanations. I needed the truth. And the truth wasn't in what he said. It was in what he'd been hiding. Dinner ended when Darren stood up, patted my shoulder, and said softly, "Let's go." His voice sounded like he was packing up an object, not speaking to someone who'd been beside him for 10 years. I stepped outside first, letting the night air sweep across my face. I didn't feel cold. I just felt clear, a clarity so sharp it almost felt calm. I understood now. His "you don't have dreams" wasn't an insult. It was a confession. And he said it because he was certain I couldn't go farther than this place, the place he'd built for me with all the little stops I never knew about. And that was what woke me up completely. When Darren locked the car door after we got in, I turned and looked straight at him. No blame, no questions. Just the look of someone who had finally seen what she needed to see. I'll find the truth, I thought, not to get even, but to finally see the man I've spent 10 years beside. That was the moment I knew. The road ahead wasn't about what he said to me. It was about what he'd been hiding, and I was ready to walk into that truth with my eyes fully open. The next morning, Darren left the house early. He didn't notice I stayed at the dining table longer than usual, or ask why I'd been silent the whole night before. His confidence made him think everything had gone back to normal. But that confidence was exactly what gave me the time and space to begin. I opened my phone and searched for an old email from the company I used to work for. A familiar address sat quietly in my inbox like a door I'd never opened. I tapped to call. The HR manager's voice was the same as I remembered, warm and professional. When I asked about the invitation to return a few years ago, she went silent for a second, as if surprised I brought it up. "We did invite you back," she said, but your husband replied that you declined because you wanted to stay home with the baby. We respected that choice. I held the phone a little away from my ear. Just a small distance, but enough for me to hear the second crack in my understanding. I thanked her and hung up. And no more questions, no reaction. I knew that if I said even one extra word, my voice might change, and I didn't want emotion slipping into what I had to do next. I needed accuracy. I set the phone on the table and looked at the dark screen. In the faint reflection, I saw my face. Not sad, not hurt. Just flat in a way that felt almost dangerous. So you spoke for me, I thought. You decided for me. And then you hid it. I opened my laptop and searched for the course I'd wanted to take years ago. I remembered how excited I'd been for weeks. How he told me the spots were gone. How I'd believed him. I dialed the number from the old ad. A young woman answered, bright and quick. I asked about that year's enrollment. She checked the records and said, "Oh, your husband called. And he asked us to give the spot to someone else because you were busy with the baby and couldn't attend." I closed my eyes for 1 second. Not long, not heavy. Just enough to hold my breath before it slipped out of control. 2 calls, 2 pieces of a puzzle, 2 explanations that once made me think life had simply fallen out of rhythm. But no, life hadn't arranged anything. He had. I rested my hand on the table, my fingertips brushing a strip of light across the wood. The light was cold, straight, like the realization cutting through me. Darren didn't just stop me. He erased opportunities the moment they appeared. Not because he wanted to protect the family, not because he thought I was overwhelmed, but because he feared the simplest thing, that I might have a life outside of his control. When that truth landed, I didn't feel pain. I just felt awake. A clarity as cold as a mirror. I opened a drawer and took out a small notebook, the one where I'd written little things over the years. I flipped through it. Some pages had only single-line notes. Darren said, "Now isn't the time." He said, "Let me handle it." He said I don't need to do anything else. When I wrote them, I didn't think they meant anything. They were just reminders of how I'd felt. But today, each line looked like evidence. I spent the whole morning connecting the pieces. After the first 2 calls, I made 3 more. People I used to work with, or people who knew Darren through the training center. Each call added a small detail, and each detail fit perfectly with the next. One person said, "Oh, he told us you were stressed with the baby and didn't want to return to work." Another said, "He asked for the course details so he could decide for you." Someone else added, "Your husband asked about the program and said you weren't ready." I listened to each sentence, noted every detail. No guessing, no reacting. I was only collecting the truth, the only thing solid enough to keep me standing. When I closed the notebook, the truth was thick enough that I couldn't pretend not to see it anymore. He called me someone without dreams, yet he was the one who erased each dream before it ever had a chance to take shape. I stood up and walked to the window. Noon light spilled through the curtain, laying a pale strip across the floor. It brightened everything around me, but it didn't warm me. It only made every line sharper. Yet I wasn't sad. Sadness is for things you still want to hold on to. What I wanted now was clarity. I started preparing, not for a fight. I didn't want any of this to drown in chaos. Darren was strongest when the other person lost control. I wasn't giving him that advantage. I photocopied the old emails, saved the call history, wrote down the names of everyone who had confirmed what happened. Each piece of evidence went onto the table like a shard of cold glass. In the afternoon, I called Claire, the coworker I spent my early years with. She remembered clearly how I told her I wanted to return to work, but everything somehow felt blocked. When I asked for more detail, she hesitated, then said quietly, "I always wondered if Darren wanted to keep you at home, but I didn't dare say anything." I didn't want to put you in a difficult spot, I thanked her. A short thank you, steady and light. When I hung up, I realized the picture was complete. Darren wasn't a pillar. He was simply the person most afraid of losing control in this house. I gathered the notebook, the papers, and placed them in a thin envelope. Then I stood up and stepped into the hallway. Each step felt light but certain, like the floor already knew I wasn't standing in the same place anymore. When I reached the living room door, my hand resting on the cold handle, I knew exactly what I was about to do. Not for revenge, not to prove I was right, but to make Darren face what he'd avoided for 10 years. I wasn't small. He just never bothered to see me grow. And this time, he would have to face it, with no way to look away. That evening, and the house was so quiet I could hear the clock's second hand jump with every tick. I set the envelope on the living room table, then texted Darren and Melissa to come downstairs. The message was short, no explanation. I didn't want to build tension ahead of time. I wanted the truth to create its own weight. Darren came down first, annoyed at being called so abruptly. Melissa followed, wearing her usual expression, that thin layer of arrogance, like glass ready to crack if touched. "What's going on?" Darren asked. I sat down and pointed to the 2 seats across from me. "Sit." My voice wasn't raised, wasn't icy, just flat, the kind of flatness that makes people unsure what's coming. Darren watched me for a few seconds, then sat. Melissa did too. I didn't circle around the point. I opened the envelope and placed each document on the table one by one, slowly. The email from my old company, the confirmation from the course, notes from people who'd heard Darren explain things on my behalf. Layer by layer. Darren looked at the papers like he was seeing himself but couldn't admit it. Melissa lowered her head, realizing her slip had opened the door that led me here. "All of this," I said, my voice steady, "is what you decided for me." Darren swallowed, his shoulders tightening. "Talia, I raised my hand slightly, cutting him off. "No explanations." I turned one of the emails toward him. We invited her back, but her husband said she didn't want to. I let that sentence hang in the air between the 3 of us like a needle, sharp enough to draw blood without touching skin. Then I placed the second line down. "He said she was busy with the baby and couldn't attend." Darren clenched his hands. "I did that because—" This time, I didn't stop him with a gesture. I stopped him with the only sentence I had prepared for tonight. "You called me someone without dreams, but you've spent the last 10 years afraid of the opposite." Melissa looked up. Darren froze. The defensiveness in his eyes pulled back like water hitting fire. Not because I raised my voice, but because the truth was standing in the room, too clear for him to step around. I didn't need anyone to defend me. The truth defended me on its own. Darren opened his mouth a few times, but couldn't find a single sentence strong enough to patch what was laid out on the table. He couldn't deny it, couldn't shift the blame, couldn't redirect the story. Every door he'd ever used to keep control was wide open now, and he was standing in the middle of the room with nothing in his hands. Melissa stayed completely silent. Every ounce of arrogance she carried peeled away in minutes, not because I put her down, but because she saw Darren no longer standing in the place she'd pedestalized him. I stood up. No regret, no apology, no explanation. I pulled a thin stack of papers from my jacket pocket and set it on the table beside the evidence. Separation papers. Darren stared at them like they were something he never imagined could exist in real life. He half rose from his seat, ready to say something, but I'd already turned away. "We don't need to say anything else," I said quietly. "I've heard enough." I walked to the door, grabbed my keys, put on my coat. I didn't look back. I didn't wait for anyone to react. My steps weren't fast or slow, just steady, like I was walking a path I'd always known but somehow forgotten was under my feet. Outside, the air was cold, but not the kind that makes you shiver. the kind that sharpens your mind. I got into the car, hands resting on the wheel. In the rearview mirror, the house stood still. It wasn't a place full of memories anymore. It was just a structure, no longer a foundation. I took out my phone and did the first thing I needed to do. Call my old company. When are you available? The HR manager asked. Starting tomorrow, I said. My voice was so light I barely recognized it. Light because nothing was holding it down anymore. The second call, the training center. The new session opens next month. We'd be happy to prioritize you. All right, I said. I'll be there, not to prove anything to Darren, but to return to myself, the person he'd spent 10 years trying to shrink. I leaned back in the seat. Street lights slid across the windshield, slicing through the dark in quiet streaks. I didn't need to look back to know Darren was standing in the living room with all the papers he couldn't deny. I didn't need to listen to know Melissa was silent now, as if she'd never laughed at me at all. They'll need time to understand what I realized long ago. The strongest act of revenge isn't shouting. It's the calm of someone who isn't afraid anymore. When I started the car, the engine hummed just enough. Not loud, not rushed, just clear. Like me now. I looked at the road ahead, empty, long, but not intimidating. It felt like a door swinging open. I'm finally free of whoever used to stand in the way. I said one last thing, not for anyone else, but to mark the line I just crossed. I don't need you to believe in my dreams. I just need you to know you no longer get to step on them. Then I drove away, leaving behind a marriage that had become only an echo of itself, and a man who finally had to face the truth he'd always avoided. Losing me wasn't because I was small. It was because I stood up. In life, what breaks us isn't always pain. Sometimes it's not recognizing ourselves in our own story. But once we stand up and choose our direction again, no one can keep us where we were. Our calm will always be stronger than anyone else's noise. That's where this story ends. Thank you for listening all the way through. If you've ever lived through something like Talia's story, would you leave or stay? Share your thoughts below. I'd love to read them. And don't forget to subscribe and follow for more stories. Your support means everything.